I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of RFL. I'm Richard French, and we tonight honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we have a special panel of guests who are here to provide some insight and some context, not only into Dr. King's vision, but also his legacy in so many different ways as it's applied today. And we also ask the question, as we do every year, how close are we to achieving his dream when it comes to our society? Now, we're going to begin this evening, though, with a look at police-community relations, in many ways a defining issue of the past 12 months. And we're going to pay particular attention, obviously, to how it impacts specifically the African-American community. And tensions, as we all know, rose across New York and other parts of this country in July of this past year. That's when 43-year-old Eric Garner died after being put in an apparent chokehold by an NYPD officer. No charges, as you know, were filed against the officer. Then in August, it came the shooting death of 18-year-old Michael Browne. He was shot and killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and again, no charges were brought against the officer. We all know in the aftermath, an uproar around the country and certainly riots that we covered here for days and even weeks in Missouri. In November came the death of 28-year-old Akai Gurley. He was shot and killed by an officer in the stairwell of a Brooklyn housing complex. Police officials say that Gurley's death was accidental. And in Cleveland, Ohio, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, shot and killed by, again, a white police officer responding to a call of a man with a gun. Tamir was holding a fake gun, and he was shot in less than 2 seconds of the officer coming upon the scene. Well, we got a pulse of where the public feels about a lot of these issues on a broader level, and this, again, was taken from between 2010 to 2012, and it found that black males between the ages of 15 and 19 are 21 times more likely to be shot and killed by a police officer than their white counterparts. And again, this was 2 years prior to the spate of incidents that I talked about this year. And when asked whether or not race relations between the police forces and minorities will get better or worse over the next year, and this question asked far more recently, a little over a third of Americans said things, in fact, will get worse, while only 1 in 5 roughly said they will get better, and 10% say things will stay the same. All right, let's bring in our panel tonight. Gloria Browne-Marshall, she's an associate professor of political science and criminal justice administration at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Ms. Marshall, also a columnist for Black Star News and a journalist covering the U.S. Supreme Court. Dominic Carter, obviously a familiar face, political journalist and author, is with me every night between 6 and 7. Pastor Thomas Nins, he's head of the First Baptist Church of Greenwich. Pastor Nins also serves as chaplain of the Greenwich Police Department and is the diversity outreach coordinator at Brunswick School. Philip Banks recently stepped down as chief of the department of the NYPD. And Mayo Bartlett, also another familiar face for a program every Wednesday. He talks about legal issues with me. He's also the former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and now a defense attorney with a lot of high-profile civil rights cases to his credit. Gentlemen, Professor, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it. Ms. Banks, to start with you. Obviously, the headlines have dominated the questions of treatment from both who's profiled to what happens when they're stopped to the chances even of violence in an encounter between law enforcement and people of color, and then also the criminal justice system that happens even after if there is in effect an arrest. The debate, it seems, has been, depending on one's perspective and one's color, there's a big gap between perception and reality. You've been on both sides of this. I'm curious your perspective. As people may know, you're the child of law enforcement, father serving for decades. You yourself, more than 20 years in the force, rising to one of the highest levels of the NYPD. You've seen this play out. What is the reality, and how close is that attached to the perception right now that there's two brands of justice depending on the color of your skin?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say to my fellow panelists, how are you? Happy New Year. Hope all is well. And thank you for having me here as well. here's the reality how I see it. Law enforcement, specifically the New York City Police Department, is not as bad as the perceptions out there. But on the flip side, they are nowhere as good as they think that they are. So there needs to be a concrete discussion, and a discussion means that you have to be willing to leave that discussion saying is that I've learned something and I have to make changes. And that's one of the hardest things to do, to look into that particular mirror and make changes. I think the NYPD is a great organization, and I think they try to do the right thing. One of the things that we, and I will prefix that we are not good at, is looking at the mirror and saying we are wrong on this particular issue and we have to make changes. And that's something that we could do a lot better, and I would probably say that law enforcement in general across the country can do better. The NYPD is the face of the criminal justice system, right? So there are major flaws, as I've seen in my 20 years, with the correctional system, with the court system, with the judges. But because we are the face of law enforcement, living with the members of the community every single day, we bear the brunt of it. And that's an awesome responsibility. And I think that we need to take much more concrete steps to address that particular issue, because we could go a long way forward to solving that problem.
Do you think if you're going to make a material change, is it in the precinct house, the mentalities before the officers go out in the community, or is it the procedures like stop and frisk or community, that type of policing where it all but begs that they're going to go to particular zip codes and they're going to stop particular people that fit particular profiles? Is it the procedures, or is it the perception of law enforcement themselves that has to change?
You know, that's a very good question, because a lot of people don't address that. The issue, and I'd say this from looking at this issue for 20 years, the issue is not the local police officers in the precinct. The issue is the management and the policies that's coming out, and not putting safeguards to ensure that what your intent is actually being carried out. So as a manager, right, and as a supervisor in the police department, that you draw policies, and the intent is a policy to be followed ABC. But when it goes out there, right, we oftentimes look at the bottom line. The bottom line is that homicide is decreasing. The bottom line is shootings is decreasing. And we're not looking at the unintended consequences of our particular policy. So make no mistake about this. I feel as though the problem is the leadership, which I'm a part of. I'm certainly want to be clear. I'm not separating myself from that. And I would challenge that as law enforcement, the policies that the leaders are putting forth, they're not putting enough check and balances systems to ensure that it is being carried out in the appropriate manner, so that the officers on the ground, right, they bear the brunt of that, and that's something we need to look at.
You have a unique perspective because come Sundays you're the pastor, and the flock might feel one way, but also you're the chaplain in the police department. You're getting the perspective from folks when there's no microphones around and they're telling what you think. The divide, from your viewpoint, where is it really most acute?
I think that it's most acute in our perceptions. When you talk about better and worse, the relationship of law enforcement to a community, a lot of that has to do with the perception of the people on both sides of that equation. The tension between law enforcement and members of our community is nothing new. This is not new, but I think sometimes it's exacerbated by the media, how the media will treat a particular situation and the response of those in those situations. It's the long way of saying that there are some people who now and in the past and perhaps in the future are always going to feel some kind of tension or apprehension when they see us coming, law enforcement. And there are going to be some officers in the past, now, and possibly in the future who have some kind of apprehension depending on what aspect of the community they're servicing. So it comes down to really developing a greater comfort level and confidence in different communities.
I'd like to talk about the law in this, with you, Mayo, and you, Professor, in that people looked at the video, the Garner video, and people read the account of what happened in the stairwell in Brooklyn, and they said, well, if Garner was a white guy, I don't know if 6 cops would have jumped him. If Garner was a white guy, maybe it would have been handled differently if they want for an indictment or what they would have tried. Would Garner have been shot if he was a white guy in a stairwell? Or would he even have been in the stairwell in Brooklyn? How much from how cases are chosen to be prosecuted does color still matter in 2015?
Well, I would think that color matters when you start to make a determination as to what resources you're going to place into a case, and also about who people are. So certain zip codes are going to be revered, other zip codes are going to be cast in the light of being a place where crime occurs. But as we know, crime occurs everywhere. And if you were to stop all of the kids on the Upper East Side or in an affluent neighborhood in Scarsdale or in Bronxville, you're going to find lots of drugs, just like you will anywhere else. Probably maybe even more, because they're more affluent, it's easier to get it. They probably don't go make the purchase themselves. They have a friend who brings it to them, where maybe if I'm a poorer person, maybe I'm making the direct purchase myself, so you see me and I'm going to be stopped. The thing that was most telling to me, though, is that during this slowdown, there was a 94% decrease in arrests. And it was suggested by Pat Lynch that the police should only make the arrests that were necessary. So that begs the question as to whether 94% of the arrests were not necessary in the past.
Professor, what about that? Because many people focus on the incident where it first happens, but then there's a second and a third part. There's the trial, and then there's the consequence to it. How is the legal system, at least, because there's a perception that justice at the front end, color shades it in a way. We can debate how much. But the justice system and the legal system, how about that?
Well, there has been inequality in the application of the criminal justice system when it comes to African Americans since slavery ended in 1865 and black codes were instituted, criminal laws just for black people to make us feel extra special. So that things like loitering or vagrancy, these things would then have a 5-year imprisonment, and so slavery could be continued into the prison system, and that labor could be used for free. It was called the convict lease system. Now go forward and we have this convict lease system, only it's a different way. This country is used to bad things happening to black people. So there you have to have something very horrendous to take place before people go, just like with Eric Garner, wow, that's horrible. If that had happened to a white person, I can't see it. But all the incremental things that have taken place up to that point to allow it to happen, let's put it this way. Everyone has prejudices. Everyone has biases. Racism is the institution behind the prejudice. So you have 7% of the population, black males, making up 60 to 70% of the incarcerated population. So when you look at the whole picture, it's not just a perception. People might think, well, you're just being paranoid. Well, maybe you're being paranoid for a reason.
Dom, do you think we're going to look back and say, as bad as this year was in terms of the ugliness that we saw coming out of some tragic incidents, I mean, we'd even get into the Rice case, but a 12-year-old kid, and so many mistakes that went along, from the cop being on the force in the first place to the dispatcher giving incomplete information. But leaving that aside, did it bring up an overdue, maybe an awkward, maybe a painful conversation in this country, but it did at least start a dialogue that's going to be better down the road? Or do you think it just pulled the scab off of something that's not going to heal right anyway?
The latter. It pulled the scab off. The perception is real. You know, I grew up in the projects. You go to the projects of any urban area in America, and for whatever reason, they will tell you the police are not their friend, that the police don't look out for them. They certainly don't believe in protect and serve. And so, and when you go, Professor, over the historical element, and you know, everybody has made such a great point, as far as, you're right, we've gone from, it's gone maybe one step over, and then boom, we have this major incident. And so it's been building and building, but I think that if Dr. King were here, he would say, my brothers and sisters, what's going on with this outrageous black-on-black crime? And then I think that when it comes to the issues that remain to be seen, law enforcement, he would say this is the greatest burden that people of color face today. All
right, well, we're going to take a break. But when we come back, we're going to get into a lot of the social dynamics. And there's major disparities in this country when it comes to household incomes, but also households too. We're going to talk about that when we come back. Please stay with us.